He had been told America was soft, distracted, a country of jazz and cinema, too comfortable to fight, too fractured to produce. That was the word from above, and he believed it, because what else would a soldier believe? Then the doors opened. It was 1943. He was a German prisoner of war, and he was standing inside an American grocery store. He had been given permission to walk its aisles, and what he saw there, the sheer, silent, overwhelming abundance of it, broke something in him that no battle had touched. He had expected a weakened enemy. He found a country that could feed the world and still have shelves left over. The war had taught him to read the enemy. Every soldier learns this, not from manuals, but from the slow accumulation of what the other side leaves behind. Shell casings, ration tins, the quality of a boot. These were the true dispatches from the front, the ones that told you not what your commanders believed, but what was actually true. And what German soldiers had read in those early years of war was, by their own account, mostly encouraging. The Wehrmacht, Germany's armed forces, had swept across Europe with a speed and confidence that seemed to confirm everything they had been told. France fell in 6 weeks, the Low Countries in days. Even the British had been chased to the sea at Dunkirk, retreating in fishing boats and pleasure craft, a humiliation so complete it looked like proof. The German soldier in those years walked with the particular ease of a man who has not yet been surprised. America, in those early calculations, was almost an afterthought. The United States had stayed out of the fighting for 2 full years. Its army was small, its public opinion divided, its industrial capacity, so the thinking went, pointed at consumer goods, not war. Germany's leadership did not take it seriously as a military force. And so, for a time, neither did the ordinary soldier. But there were men who looked more carefully. Officers who read the economic reports. Generals who studied American steel output, American railroad networks, American agricultural production, and felt something that they could not quite name, something adjacent to unease. They kept quiet about it. The mood did not allow for unease. Being taken prisoner was its own education, delivered all at once. For many German soldiers captured in North Africa in 1943, the sequence of their captivity began with the shock of the capture itself, the moment the rifle went down and the hands went up, and moved quickly into something stranger and more disorienting. They were not mistreated, they were not humiliated in the theatrical ways that propaganda had suggested the Americans might behave. They were processed, transported, and eventually placed aboard ships headed west across the Atlantic. They crossed an ocean they had never expected to cross. And when they arrived in the United States, at ports in Virginia, New York, New Jersey, they stepped ashore into a country that was, by any visible measure, completely untouched by war. Imagine what he saw. The docks were busy, but not desperate. The cities were lit. The streets held automobiles, department stores, people dressed in ordinary clothes going about ordinary lives. There was no rubble, no rationing lines, no visible fear. For a soldier who had spent months in the burning landscape of the North African campaign, who had eaten what the supply lines could manage, and slept where the ground allowed, this was not what he had prepared himself to see. One of the most repeated observations in the accounts that survive from German POWs, and they survive in letters, in post-war interviews, in reports filed by American administrators, was the simple, stunned fact of how normal everything looked, how undamaged, how full. The word several of them reached for, across different accounts, was unreal. The visit to the grocery store, and this happened in various forms at various camps, sometimes as a deliberate orientation exercise, sometimes as part of work details in nearby towns, became a fixed point in the POW memory. Picture the moment. He walks through automatic doors, or perhaps he pushes them open himself, and he enters a space that is, by the standards of wartime Europe, incomprehensible. Long, clean aisles, electric lighting, and food, not emergency food, not rationed food, not food being distributed under the watchful eyes of government officials, but food. Displayed. Arranged. In abundance so casual it borders on indifference. Canned goods in columns that stretch overhead. bread in quantities that, in the Germany he had left behind, would have represented a community's weekly allotment, meat in glass cases, sugar, coffee, butter. Not in small quantities, in quantities that suggested the supply behind them was simply inexhaustible. Several POW accounts describe a specific, common reaction. The men went quiet, not the quiet of discomfort, but the quiet of genuine cognitive disruption. The silence that falls when what you are seeing cannot be made to fit what you already know. Some men, according to accounts gathered by American observers, actually stopped walking. They stood in the aisles. They looked. One recurring detail in these accounts is the reaction to canned goods specifically, the sheer variety of them, the labels in their bright colors, the fact that there were multiple brands of the same product sitting side by side, competing for a buyer's attention. In Germany by 1943, choice of that kind had long since vanished. The idea that a country at war would devote resources to producing 17 different kinds of canned peaches was, to a German soldier's understanding of wartime economy, not just surprising. It was almost offensive. It suggested a country that was not really trying, that had not yet had to try. And that was the thought that, once it arrived, would not leave. Because the supermarket was not a symbol, it was a fact sheet written in food. The industrial capacity of the United States during the Second World War was of a scale that, even now, is difficult to hold in the mind as a single image. By 1944, American factories were producing more aircraft than all of the Axis powers combined. The Liberty Ship Program, a wartime initiative to build cargo vessels as fast as possible, eventually launched ships at a rate of roughly one every 42 hours. Henry Kaiser's shipyards, at their peak, shortened that further. The Robert E. Peary, built as a demonstration of American industrial speed, was launched just 4 days and 15 hours after her keel was laid. These numbers were not secret. German military intelligence had access to them, in various degrees of accuracy, and some of the more clear-eyed officers in the Wehrmacht understood what they meant. Albert Speer, who served as Germany's Minister of Armaments and War Production, wrote after the war about the moment he began to grasp the true scale of American output, and what it meant for any realistic calculation of the war's end. His conclusion, which he arrived at long before Germany's leadership was prepared to hear it, was that the production gap was not a problem to be solved. It was a verdict already written. But verdicts that are already written are the hardest kind to accept when you are still inside the story. The German soldier standing in the grocery aisle did not have access to Speer's reports. What he had was the evidence in front of him, which told the same story in a language that required no translation. A country that can stock its grocery stores like this, in the middle of a world war, on the other side of an ocean, is not a country that is straining. It is a country with room left over. Hit subscribe right now, because what these men admitted when they wrote home, what they said about what they had seen, changes the entire picture of how this war was understood from the inside. Do not go anywhere. The POW camps in the United States were not silent places. Men wrote letters, when they were permitted, through channels monitored by military sensors on both sides. And in those letters, carefully worded around what they knew would be read, certain truths still leaked through. The sensors on the American side collected and analyzed this correspondence, and what emerged from that reading was a portrait of men processing, in real time, an experience that contradicted everything they had been told. Some letters were careful. Men wrote in code, in implication, in the kind of language that means one thing on the surface and carries another meaning beneath it, the way you write when you know someone else is reading. But even in the careful letters, certain observations kept appearing. The size of things, the availability of things, the way Americans seemed to move through their days without the pinched, watchful awareness of scarcity that had become, for these men, the basic texture of wartime life. Other letters were less guarded. By the later years of the war, with the news from Europe growing darker, some men wrote with a directness that surprised their American readers. They had seen what they had seen. They wrote it down. Remember what he believed at the start? Here is where it breaks. The belief had been that America was a soft country. What the letters described, haltingly, in the language of men who had staked their lives on a different version of reality, was a country of almost frightening capability. A country whose softness, if that was even the right word, was simply the surface appearance of a depth that had not yet been called upon. And when it was called upon, the depth turned out to be very deep indeed. It would be wrong to suggest that all of this came as a surprise to everyone on the German side. Some of the most senior military minds in Germany had looked at the American entry into the war and felt, privately, that the calculation had changed irrevocably. Erwin Rommel, the general who had faced American forces directly in North Africa, who had seen the early struggles of American units at Kasserine Pass in February 1943 and drawn some temporary encouragement from them, updated his assessment as the months passed. The Americans learned. That was the thing that impressed and unsettled him most, according to accounts from his staff. They took losses and they adjusted. They brought equipment in quantities that could absorb those losses and keep coming. Rommel, a man whose genius rested on speed and improvisation, found himself facing an opponent who could replace whatever was destroyed faster than destruction could be accomplished. Karl Dönitz, the admiral who commanded Germany's submarine fleet, watched the Battle of the Atlantic turn against him through 1943 as American shipbuilding outpaced his ability to sink hulls. The math, which he tracked with a submariner's precision, eventually produced a conclusion that had nothing mathematical about it. He could not win a war of attrition against a country that produced ships faster than he could destroy them. He lost more submarines in May 1943 than in any previous month of the war, a period his own sailors called Black May. And he withdrew his fleet from the North Atlantic, never to regain the initiative. These men did not speak their conclusions publicly while the war continued. The architecture of the regime did not allow it. But in their private notes, in their post-war memoirs, in the testimony they gave to Allied investigators, the shape of what they had understood, and when they had understood it, came slowly into view. There is a particular kind of honesty that only becomes possible after defeat. Not the honesty of confession, exactly, but the honesty of a man who no longer has any reason to maintain the fiction. In the post-war years, German officers and surviving POWs spoke and wrote with a clarity about American strength that they could never have expressed during the war itself. And what they said, consistently, across different accounts from different men of different ranks, was a version of the same thing. They said, "We did not understand it. We were told things about America that were not true, and we believed them because we needed to, and because the structure around us did not permit doubt. And then we were put on ships and taken across the ocean and walked into a grocery store, and we understood, in a single moment, looking at shelves of canned goods under electric light, that we had been badly wrong." One of the most striking aspects of these accounts, considered together, is how physical the realization was. It was not an intellectual revision that came from reading reports or hearing news. It came from seeing. From standing in a space and looking at what was there, and understanding, in the body, what it meant. The grocery store worked as a kind of proof that no military briefing could have delivered, because it was real, and it was right in front of them, and it was impossible to explain away. The war, by that point, had already decided the question. The shelves had always been telling the answer. Most of these men eventually went home. The prisoner of war camps in the United States were, by most accounts in the historical record, functional and in many cases decent. More than the men had expected, and more than some of them felt they deserved, by the end. They worked during the day. Some of them were assigned to local farms or factories. They moved, carefully and under supervision, through the ordinary American world. They saw what ordinary American life looked like from the inside. And when the war ended and the repatriation process began, they returned to a Germany that was physically shattered, bombed, divided, cold, stripped to the bone by the long weight of the war and its ending. They had seen both worlds. They carried the comparison in them for the rest of their lives. What the German POW brought home from America was not a souvenir and not a grievance. It was something quieter and harder to carry. The memory of standing in a lit aisle surrounded by abundance and knowing, without anyone having to say it, that this was why they had lost. Not because of any single battle or any single decision, but because of this, The shelves, the lights, the sheer, indifferent, inexhaustible plenty of a country that had not even fully begun to reach. The doors to the supermarket had opened, and in the moment of that opening, the war, which was still technically being fought, somewhere, was already over. He just had to finish living through the part that came after the knowing. He had expected a weakened enemy. He had been told, by men above him who should have known, that America was soft, distracted, too divided to matter. He believed it, because soldiers believe what their world tells them to believe. And then he stood inside a grocery store in 1943, in a country at war, and saw shelves that had never been emptied. He saw the casual, unhurried evidence of a depth he had never been told about. He went quiet, the way a man goes quiet when the ground shifts beneath him, and he realizes the map he has been reading was wrong from the beginning. The haunting thing, the thing that stayed with these men into their old age, into their letters and their memoirs and their careful post-war honesty, was not the defeat itself. Defeats, a soldier learns to absorb. The haunting thing was how clearly the grocery store had told them the truth, long before the war admitted it. The shelves already knew the outcome. The men just had to finish walking through. If this kind of history, told from the inside, from the side that lost, from the private thoughts of men who understood too late, is the history you want more of, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every week, we tell the war through the eyes of those who lost it. If this one moved you, hit the like button. It helps more people find these stories. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every one. We'll see you in the next one.